Deep beneath the Vatican, behind massive doors and modern security systems, lies one of the most enigmatic places on the planet, the Vatican Secret Archives. Officially called the Apostolic Archives today, this repository contains over 85 kilometers of shelves, with documents spanning 12 centuries of human history. Here, among yellowed parchments and ancient manuscripts, may lie the answers to questions that have troubled both believers and skeptics for centuries. What if, among these countless scrolls and codices, there are texts capable of overturning our understanding of early Christianity and the very figure of Jesus? For centuries, the Catholic Church meticulously controlled access to these documents, and only in recent decades has it opened its doors to selected researchers. However, the most controversial materials remain under lock and key until certain dates, including the mysterious 27th year. Why is the Church so cautious with these texts? What secrets might they hold about Christ's earthly life, his teachings, and his relationships with his disciples? The history of the Vatican Secret Archives begins long before its official establishment. From the earliest centuries of the Church's existence, Roman pontiffs carefully preserved the most important documents: papal bulls, correspondence with monarchs, treaties, and records of church councils. However, as a single organized repository, the archive was only created in the 17th century under Pope Paul V. It was he who, in 1612, allocated a special room for the systematic storage of church documents, initiating what we now know as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Initially, the archive was housed in modest rooms within the Vatican Palace, but with time and the growth of its document collection, it required more and more space. Particularly active additions to the archive occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries, when entire libraries of closed monasteries and private collections of rare manuscripts flowed into its holdings. One of the key moments in the archive's history was the acquisition of the oldest Christian texts. During the early Middle Ages, monastic scribes preserved many documents dating back to the first centuries of Christianity. Some of these were copies of even older texts, possibly contemporary with the apostles or their direct disciples. Of particular value are the documents obtained by the Vatican as a result of the Crusades. When European knights returned from the Holy Land, they brought with them manuscripts discovered in ancient monasteries of the Middle East, a region where Christianity originated and where texts unknown to the Western Church might have been preserved. In the 16th century, when Europe was shaken by the Reformation, the Catholic Church particularly carefully controlled access to ancient texts that might contain information contradicting official doctrine. It was then that many documents were classified and placed in special repositories with limited access. Behind the massive walls of the Vatican lies one of the most astonishing knowledge storage systems in the world. The Apostolic Archive is organized with astonishing meticulousness, combining centuries-old traditions with the latest technologies. 85 kilometers of shelving are divided into sections, each corresponding to a specific historical period or thematic category. At the heart of the archive is the Ancient Manuscripts Department, where the most valuable documents, manuscripts from the first millennium of Christianity, are stored in special climate-controlled capsules. Here one can find early Christian codices, fragments of apocryphal Gospels, and letters from the Church Fathers. Access to these materials is strictly limited, even for accredited scholars. The second level of the archive contains documents from the medieval period, papal bulls, records of church councils, and correspondence with European monarchs. It is here that the Inquisition protocols and documents related to the persecution of heretical teachings are stored, many of which offered alternative interpretations of the life and teachings of Christ. But of greatest interest to researchers is the so-called Index Secretum, a special catalog of documents whose access is regulated by a special papal decree. These materials are stored in a separate bunker with climate control and a multi-level security system. It is here, according to historians, that texts capable of shedding light on the lost years of Christ and his relationship with his closest disciples may be found. The procedure for accessing archival documents is strictly regulated. A researcher must have a doctoral degree, recommendations from an academic institution, and a clearly substantiated research topic. The request is reviewed by a special commission of cardinals, and even after approval, the scholar is granted access only to specific documents directly relevant to their work. Since 2000, the Vatican has begun a gradual process of declassifying its archives. Every few years, new categories of documents become available to the scientific community. This process is carefully planned and tied to specific historical dates and anniversaries. The year 2027 was not chosen by chance. It marks 2,000 years since the supposed beginning of Jesus' preaching activity. By this date, it is planned to open access to a whole range of documents related to the early period of Christianity, including some texts that may contain alternative testimonies about the life of the founder of Christianity. Beyond the four canonical Gospels lies an entire world of forgotten and forbidden texts, the Apocrypha, which paint a completely different picture of Jesus Christ. These ancient manuscripts, rejected by the Church in the early centuries of Christianity, may hold the keys to understanding the true nature of the Savior's teachings. The most well-known Apocrypha, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Judas, are already accessible to researchers and the general public. They show a Jesus whose words and actions sometimes radically differ from the image presented in the Bible. For example, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus appears more as a Gnostic sage than a Messiah promising salvation through faith. And the Gospel of Mary Magdalene hints at a special role for women in early Christianity, which was later deliberately debased by church hierarchs. However, these texts are merely the tip of the iceberg. Historians believe that in the first centuries AD, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of different Gospels and epistles, most of which were lost or deliberately destroyed during the struggle against heresies. Some of them may have been preserved in secret Vatican archives. Among the possible sensational documents that may be stored in closed archives, researchers name full versions of already known fragmentary apocrypha. For example, the Gospel of Peter, of which only a small part describing the resurrection of Christ in a somewhat different light than the canonical texts has come down to us. A full version of this document could reveal new details about the last days of Jesus' life and the events after his death. Texts related to Judeo-Christian communities, the first followers of Jesus who considered him the Messiah but continued to observe Jewish rites and laws, are of particular interest. Their Gospels, such as the Lost Gospel of the Hebrews or the Gospel of the Nazarenes, could contain unique eyewitness accounts from those who knew Jesus personally. Vatican archives may also conceal later documents shedding light on the process of New Testament canonization, the protocols of the church councils of the 4th century, where it was decided which books would be included in the sacred canon and which would be declared heretical, could contain detailed discussions of the theological and political motives for this choice. Why, then, were these texts excluded from the official canon? Church historians argue that the selection was made based on apostolic authorship and conformity with oral tradition. However, critics point to political motives. Many apocrypha contained ideas that undermined the nascent church hierarchy, from the equality of women to the denial of the need for intermediaries between man and God. In the canonical Gospels, there exists a mysterious gap. 18 years of Jesus Christ's life about which there is not a single mention. After the episode where the 12-year-old Jesus converses with the wise men in the temple, the narrative abruptly shifts to his 30th birthday, when he is baptized by John and begins his public ministry. What happened to the future founder of Christianity during these lost years? This question has stirred the minds of historians, theologians, and ordinary believers for centuries. Among the documents that may be declassified by the Vatican by 2027, manuscripts potentially shedding light on this mysterious period are of particular interest. Some researchers believe that fragments of lost Gospels containing descriptions of Jesus' youth and early adulthood are preserved in the secret archives. One of the most intriguing theories concerns Jesus' possible travels to the East. The archives may contain documents confirming his stay in India, where he allegedly studied meditative practices and philosophy with local sages. Proponents of this version point to striking parallels between some of Christ's teachings and Eastern spiritual traditions. Another hypothesis suggests that the young Jesus spent a significant amount of time in Egypt, the cradle of ancient wisdom. There, he could have been initiated into the secret knowledge of Egyptian priests, studying alchemy, astrology, and healing. Hints of an Egyptian period can be found in the apocryphal Infancy Gospel, which mentions the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, but canonical texts remain silent about this period. It is highly probable that the Vatican archives contain documents related to the Essenes, an ascetic Jewish sect that dwelled by the Dead Sea. Many scholars believe that Jesus might have spent his formative years in their community, studying sacred scriptures and strict spiritual practices. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, revealed astonishing parallels between the teachings of the Essenes and early Christianity. Of particular interest is the possibility of documents concerning Jesus' life as a craftsman. It is known that he was the son of a carpenter, but the details of his own professional activity remain in the shadows. Some researchers suggest that during the lost years, Jesus might have traveled throughout the Roman Empire as an itinerant craftsman, which would explain his deep knowledge of various cultures and social strata. In the shadowy halls of the Vatican Library are preserved the most ancient testimonies to the genesis of the Christian faith, manuscripts whose value is truly immeasurable. Among them, a special place is held by Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving copies of the Bible, dating back to the 4th century AD. This astonishing document, written on the finest parchment in Greek uncial script, contains an almost complete text of the Septuagint and the New Testament, serving as a cornerstone for understanding the formation of the Christian canon. However, Codex Vaticanus is merely the tip of the iceberg. Beyond the walls of the publicly accessible part of the library, in special climate-controlled repositories, even more ancient and astonishing texts may reside. Historians hypothesize the existence of manuscript fragments from the 2nd and even 1st centuries, a time when memories of Jesus were still fresh in the minds of his followers. Of particular interest is the possibility of the so-called Q document being present in the closed archives, a hypothetical source that biblical scholars believe formed the basis of the Synoptic Gospels. This text, if it truly exists, could represent the earliest record of Christ's teachings made during the lifetime of the apostles. No less significant could be the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a collection of ancient Greek manuscripts discovered in Egypt at the end of the 19th century. Although some of these documents are available to scholars, there is evidence that the most controversial fragments were acquired by the Vatican and have not yet been published. Among them could be unknown logia, sayings, of Jesus, and descriptions of events in his life, absent from the canonical texts. The Vatican Archives may also conceal the oldest copies of the Gospel of the Hebrews, a lost text used by the early Judeo-Christian communities. This document is particularly valuable because it reflects the understanding of Christ by people who shared his cultural and religious context. If these documents truly exist and are revealed in 2027, our understanding of early Christianity could change dramatically. We may discover that the original teachings of Jesus were interpreted by subsequent generations in accordance with their own cultural and political realities, and that some key aspects of his message were lost or transformed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE marked a turning point in the history of Christianity. Convened by Emperor Constantine the Great, it was intended to end the theological disputes that were tearing apart the young church. Official history portrays it as a triumph of true faith over heresies, especially Arianism, which denied Christ's consubstantiality with God the Father. But what if political intrigues and compromises, which forever changed the face of the Christian religion, were hidden behind the scenes of this historical event? The secret archives of the Vatican may contain documents revealing the true background of the decisions made at the Council. First and foremost, this concerns the famous Nicene Creed, which affirmed the divine nature of Christ. Some historians believe that the formulation of consubstantiality was dictated not so much by theological considerations as by Emperor Constantine's desire to strengthen the unity of the empire through the unification of religion. Of particular interest are the possible protocols of the Council's closed sessions, where bishops discussed the most contentious issues. Contemporary accounts point to heated debates and even physical clashes between proponents of different Christological concepts. What arguments were made behind closed doors? What compromises were reached? And what alternative formulations had to be abandoned? No less important an aspect of the Council of Nicaea was the question of the canon of Holy Scripture. Although the final approval of the list of biblical books occurred later, it was at the Council of Nicaea that the principles for selecting texts were laid down. The archives may contain lists of Gospels and epistles that were considered for inclusion in the canon, but were rejected for various reasons, from doubts about their apostolic origin to ideas contained within them that contradicted the emerging orthodoxy. The role of Emperor Constantine in the Council's decisions seems particularly intriguing. As a newly converted Christian who retained many pagan beliefs, he nevertheless actively intervened in theological disputes. Some sources indicate that his influence was decisive in formulating key dogmas. Perhaps the Vatican archives contain the emperor's personal correspondence with leading bishops, revealing the true motives of his religious policy. Another little-known aspect of the Council of Nicaea is the discussion of the status of women in the Church. In the early centuries of Christianity, women played a significant role in religious communities. Some even held positions close to the priesthood. However, by the 4th century, there was a trend towards limiting their participation in church life. There is evidence that this issue was also raised at the Council, and the decisions made on it may have been more radical than commonly believed. The mystery of the Knights Templar and their connection to the Vatican is one of the most intriguing enigmas of medieval history. This powerful knightly order founded in 1118 to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, transformed over 2 centuries into a formidable military and financial force. But what if the true mission of the Templars was much deeper, to preserve secret knowledge about the life of Christ, inaccessible to the broad masses of believers? Among the documents that may be declassified by 2027, materials related to the trial of the Templars hold a special place. In 1307, the French King Philip IV orchestrated the sudden arrest of all members of the order in France. The knights were accused of heresy, idolatry, and other grave sins. Under torture, many confessed to renouncing Christ and worshipping the mysterious idol Baphomet. Official interrogation protocols are kept in the Vatican, but historians believe that the most shocking testimonies were never made public. According to some sources, the Templars confessed not only to the formal accusations, but also revealed details of their secret doctrine, an alternative version of Christianity based on apocryphal texts and esoteric traditions of the East. Of particular interest are documents concerning the excavations conducted by the Templars on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. For 9 years after the order's founding, the Knights occupied the territory of the former Jerusalem Temple and, according to some accounts, carried out extensive underground works there. What were they looking for? Some researchers believe that the goal of their search was ancient manuscripts hidden there by the Essenes before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. The legend of the Holy Grail is closely intertwined with the history of the Templars. In the classical interpretation, the Grail is the cup from the Last Supper, into which the blood of the crucified Christ was later collected. However, in the esoteric tradition of the Templars, the Grail could have had an entirely different meaning. It could have been ancient texts containing the true teachings of Jesus, not distorted by later church dogmas. After the order's downfall, many Templar documents and relics fell into the hands of the Church. Pope Clement V, who officially dissolved the order under pressure from the French king, gained access to their archives. The most controversial materials were removed from circulation and placed in a secret repository, the predecessor of the current Apostolic Archive. Among possible sensational discoveries are documents confirming that the Templars found evidence of Jesus' travels to the East during his lost years. Another intriguing possibility is proof that the order held information about the descendants of Christ, if one believes the theory of his marriage to Mary Magdalene. In the shadow of official Christianity, there always existed teachings that offered a different view of Jesus' nature and his message. The Gnostics, followers of esoteric spiritual currents in the 1st centuries AD, created a rich tradition of texts that radically reinterpreted Christian doctrine. The word "zero" means "one," but not ordinary knowledge. Rather, it refers to a hidden knowledge accessible only to the initiated. For Gnostics, salvation came not through faith or good deeds, but through a special inner enlightenment that revealed the true nature of the divine and human. In their cosmology, the material world was not the creation of the highest God, but of a lower demiurge, an imperfect or even malevolent being. Jesus in the Gnostic tradition appeared not so much as a redeemer of sins, but as a bearer of secret knowledge, capable of freeing the human spirit from the captivity of matter. His suffering and death on the cross were considered an illusion by many Gnostics. The divine Christ could not truly incarnate in crude matter or experience physical pain. Most Gnostic texts were destroyed during the Church's struggle against heresies, and until the 20th century, scholars knew about them only from refutations written by ecclesiastical polemicists. The situation changed in 1945 when an entire library of Gnostic manuscripts was discovered near the Egyptian city of Nag Hammadi, hidden in clay jars about 16 centuries ago. This discovery revolutionized the understanding of early Christianity, revealing the astonishing diversity of spiritual currents that existed before the establishment of the Orthodox canon. However, even the Nag Hammadi library represents only a fragment of the once vast Gnostic literature. Many researchers believe that other Gnostic texts, collected by the Church during its struggle against heresies and preserved for internal study, may be stored in the secret archives of the Vatican. Of particular interest is the possible existence of complete versions of works known only in fragments, such as the Gospel of Truth or Pistis Sophia. These texts could clarify many mysterious aspects of Gnostic theology and its influence on the formation of Christian dogmatics. Among potential sensations are texts from the Valentinian school, one of the most philosophically sophisticated branches of Gnosticism. Valentinus, who lived in the 2nd century in Rome, created a complex cosmological system that combined elements of Platonism, Christianity, and Eastern religions. His teaching about the pleroma, the divine fullness consisting of 30 eons, or emanations of God, was so influential that it almost became the official doctrine of the Church. No less significant could be documents related to Manichaeism, a syncretic religion founded in the 3rd century by the prophet Mani, which combined elements of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Manichaeism, with its radical dualism of light and darkness, spirit and matter, spread from China to North Africa and seriously competed with Christianity for the souls of believers. St. Augustine, one of the greatest church fathers, spent 9 years in the ranks of the Manichaeans before converting to Orthodox Christianity. Why, then, were Gnostic teachings so resolutely rejected by the nascent Church? The official position states that they distorted the true teaching of Christ, introducing alien elements of pagan philosophy. However, critics also point to political motives. Gnosticism, with its emphasis on personal spiritual experience, undermined the authority of the ecclesiastical hierarchy as an intermediary between man and God. Furthermore, many Gnostic groups practiced equality between men and women in the religious sphere, which contradicted the patriarchal tendencies within the Church. Among all the mysteries hidden in the Vatican's secret archives, one of the most intriguing concerns the relationship between Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. For centuries, canonical Christianity has presented Magdalene as a repentant sinner, a devoted follower of the Savior. However, ancient texts, which may be kept under lock and key in the Apostolic Archive, paint a completely different picture, one of deep spiritual and possibly personal intimacy, which has been carefully concealed by Church tradition. Already known apocryphal Gospels, especially the Gospel of Philip, contain intriguing hints. One of the most frequently cited fragments states that, quote, "The damage to the ancient papyrus prevents reading the full context of this passage, but many researchers see in it an indication of a special relationship between Jesus and Mary." The Vatican archives may contain complete, undamaged versions of such texts. Of particular interest is the possibility of unknown fragments of the Gospel of Mary, a Gnostic text in which Magdalene appears as Christ's closest disciple, who received secret teachings from him that were inaccessible to other apostles. The most controversial theory, which could find confirmation in classified documents, concerns a possible marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Supporters of this hypothesis point to several indirect pieces of evidence in already known texts. Firstly, Mary's presence at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, where Jesus performed his first miracle, turning water into wine. Some researchers believe that this could have been their own wedding, as it is strange that the evangelist does not name the bride and groom. Secondly, Mary's status at the crucifixion and after the resurrection. According to Jewish traditions of that time, it was the wife who had the right to prepare her husband's body for burial, and it was Magdalene who first came to the tomb with aromatics. She was also the first to see the resurrected Christ, an honor that seems unusual, unless a special connection between them is assumed. Even more sensational is the theory of possible descendants from this union. According to some medieval legends, after Jesus' crucifixion, a pregnant Mary Magdalene fled to France, where she gave birth to a child, initiating the Merovingian dynasty, the first kings of the Franks. This version, popularized in modern literature, generates skepticism among most serious historians, but it is not impossible that documents shedding light on this mystery may be kept in the Vatican Archives. The Church traditionally rejects such theories, pointing to the absence of direct mentions of Jesus' marriage in canonical texts. However, critics note that the absence of such mentions could be the result of deliberate editing during the formation of the canon in the 4th century, a period when ascetic ideals came to dominate Christian ethics and the role of women in the Church was significantly restricted. The Vatican Archives, long inaccessible to the general public, are gradually opening their doors to researchers. This process, which began in the late 19th century, has accelerated significantly in recent decades, allowing scholars to delve into previously classified documents and reevaluate many aspects of Christian history. A turning point was Pope Leo XIII's decision in 1881 to partially open the archives to qualified researchers, recognizing their historical value for all humanity. However, access remained strictly regulated and limited. The real breakthrough came under Pope John Paul II, who significantly liberalized the policy of access to archival materials. Under his leadership, in the 1990s, entire collections of documents were declassified, including materials related to the Vatican's activities during World War II. His successor, Benedict XVI, continued this trend, opening access in 2006 to the archives of Pope Pius XI's pontificate, which allowed historians to study more deeply the Church's relations with fascist regimes. The current pontiff, Pope Francis, took another decisive step, announcing in 2019 the full opening of the archives from the World War II period. This decision was met with enthusiasm by the scientific community, as it sheds light on the controversial role of Pope Pius XII during the Holocaust. As for documents related to early Christianity, their declassification process is proceeding more cautiously. Over the past 30 years, some previously classified materials have become available to researchers, including fragments of apocryphal Gospels and commentaries on them by medieval theologians. Among the most significant finds is the discovery in the archives of a complete Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas, previously known only in the Coptic translation from the Nag Hammadi Library. This document, dating from the late 2nd century, contains 114 sayings of Jesus, many of which are absent from the canonical Gospels. Another important discovery was the Bobbio Codex, a 7th century palimpsest, beneath the text of which scholars found fragments of a previously unknown apocrypha, presumably containing a description of Jesus' youth. Particular attention was drawn to the declassification in 2010 of the so-called Vatican palimpsest, a manuscript in which fragments of correspondence between early Christian communities, dating from the late 1st century, were found beneath the text of a medieval sermon. These letters contain mentions of liturgical practices significantly different from later tradition, and hints at the special role of women in the first Christian assemblies. The year 2027. This date was not accidentally chosen by the Vatican for declassifying a special category of documents. It holds deep symbolism connected with key events in Christian history. According to the calculations of many biblical scholars, precisely 2,000 years ago, in the 27th year AD, the 30-year-old Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist and began his public ministry. Thus, the opening of the archives will become a kind of jubilee, the 2000th anniversary of Christian teachings. The selection of this date may also be linked to ancient prophecies and numerical symbolism, so significant for the Christian tradition. The number 7 in biblical numerology symbolizes completeness, the fulfillment of the divine plan. 2 plus 7 equals 9, a number associated with the ultimate revelation of truth. Some researchers point to a connection with apocalyptic texts, which speak of the unveiling of mysteries at the end of time. What documents might become accessible in 2027? According to historians, it is primarily about materials related to the formation of early Christianity, the period of the first 3 centuries AD, when the foundations of doctrine and church organization were laid. First and foremost, these could be previously unknown apocryphal gospels or their fragments. Of particular interest are texts of Judeo-Christian origin, testimonies from those communities that maintained a direct connection with the apostles and the first disciples of Jesus. These documents may contain versions of Christ's teachings different from those that were canonized at the church councils of the 4th century. No less significant could be materials shedding light on the process of forming the New Testament canon. The decision on which books to consider divinely inspired and which to consider heretical was made during complex theological and political discussions. The protocols of these discussions, if they have survived, could radically change our understanding of how the official version of Christianity developed. Researchers place special hopes on the possible disclosure of documents related to Jesus's lost years, the period between his childhood and the beginning of his ministry. If the archives truly contain evidence of young Jesus's travels to India, Egypt, or his training with the Essenes, this could force a re-evaluation of the origins of Christian doctrine and its connection with other spiritual traditions of the ancient world. What do authoritative researchers think about the mysterious documents that may be declassified by the Vatican in 2027? The scientific community is divided into 2 camps: skeptics, who consider talk of sensational discoveries exaggerated, and those who admit the possibility of truly revolutionary texts. Professor of Biblical Studies at Princeton University, Elaine Pagels, known for her research on Gnostic Gospels, takes a cautious stance. Undoubtedly, valuable early Christian texts are stored in the Vatican archives, but it is unlikely that they contain any radically new information about the life of Jesus. Rather, these will be documents that supplement our understanding of the diversity of Christian currents of the first centuries. Bart Ehrman, one of the leading specialists in New Testament textual criticism, agrees with her. The Church has never hidden the existence of alternative Gospels and Apocrypha. The question is their historical reliability. Texts written 2 or 3 centuries after the events have dubious value as biographical sources. However, other scholars are less skeptical. Archaeologist and historian James Tabor, a researcher of early Judeo-Christian communities, states, "We know that in the first decades after Jesus' death, there were various groups of his followers, some of whom were closely associated with his family. Their testimonies may have been preserved in the form of documents, later declared heretical, but not completely destroyed. Particularly intriguing is the hypothesis of Israeli scholar Shmuel Golden about the existence in the Vatican archives of Aramaic or ancient Hebrew texts preceding the Greek Gospels. Jesus and his closest disciples spoke Aramaic. It is logical to assume that the first records of his teaching were made in this language. Such documents would have tremendous historical value, as they would reflect the teaching of Christ without Hellenistic overlays. As for the lost years of Jesus, scholars' opinions also differ. Most Western researchers believe that Jesus spent his youth in Galilee, studying the Torah and learning the trade of a carpenter. However, Indian historian Holger Kirsten put forward a theory about the young Jesus's journey to India, where he allegedly studied Buddhism and Hinduism. In the Buddhist monasteries of Ladakh and Tibet, mentions have been preserved of a Western teacher named Isa, whose teaching strikingly resembles the Gospel sermons, Kirsten claims. This version is categorically rejected by most academic researchers, including John Dominic Crossan, one of the founders of the Jesus Seminar. There is no reliable historical evidence of Jesus's presence outside Palestine. Parallels between his teaching and Eastern philosophies can be explained by universal human spiritual quests and the influence of Hellenistic culture, which synthesized various traditions. Of particular interest is the question of a possible marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Professor Karen King of Harvard University, who researched a papyrus fragment mentioning Jesus's wife, notes, even if such documents exist, they rather reflect the beliefs of certain Christian groups of the 2nd–3rd centuries than the historical reality of the 1st century. In the world of the Vatican's secret archives, where history intertwines with legends, conspiracy theories hold a special place. They stir the imagination, promising sensational revelations about the life of Christ. But how does one distinguish well-founded hypotheses from fantastic conjectures? This question becomes especially pertinent in light of the anticipated declassification of documents in 2027. When it comes to the Vatican's secret archives, even skeptics involuntarily lower their voices. The very atmosphere of mystery surrounding ancient manuscripts creates fertile ground for the most incredible assumptions. However, a serious researcher must be guided not by emotions, but by methodology. The first sign distinguishing a scientific hypothesis from a conspiracy theory is reliance on verifiable facts. If an author claims that the archives contain documents about the marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, they must provide circumstantial evidence supporting the possibility of such texts existing. For example, mentions in known historical sources or archaeological finds indicating this tradition. Without such a factual basis, the theory remains mere speculation. The second criterion is logical consistency. Many conspiracy theories are built on the assumption of a centuries-old conspiracy of church hierarchs hiding the truth from believers. But how realistic is it that thousands of people over 2,000 centuries could maintain absolute secrecy? History shows that even the most protected secrets, sooner or later, become public knowledge. The third aspect is the motivation of the theory's authors. If a researcher is guided not by the pursuit of truth, but by the desire for sensation or ideological considerations, their conclusions are unlikely to be objective. A scientific approach requires a willingness to revise one's hypotheses when new facts emerge, which is usually absent in the creators of conspiracy theories. Particular caution should be exercised with theories built on so-called arguments from silence. The absence of mention of a fact in historical sources is not proof of its concealment. For example, the silence of the evangelists about Jesus' youth can be explained by the fact that this period was simply not considered significant for Christ's spiritual mission, rather than by the Church hiding his travels to India. When analyzing potential secret Vatican documents, it is important to consider the historical context of their creation. Many apocryphal texts were written several centuries after the events they describe, during an era of active theological disputes. They reflect the beliefs and political interests of their time, not the historical reality of the first century. This does not diminish their value as sources for the history of Christian thought, but it requires a critical approach to the biographical information about Christ contained within them. One must not forget the problem of interpreting ancient texts. Even if unknown manuscripts are indeed stored in the Vatican archives, their content can be interpreted differently depending on the cultural and linguistic context. Many sensational discoveries are based on incorrect translation or misunderstanding of the symbolic language of ancient authors. A characteristic example of conspiratorial thinking is the theory that the Church deliberately destroyed all evidence of a married Jesus. Proponents of this version point to the absence of direct statements about Christ's celibacy in the canonical Gospels. However, they ignore the fact that in Jewish culture of that time, celibacy was an extremely unusual phenomenon, and if Jesus had been married, it would have been considered so normal as to require no special mention. On the other hand, his celibacy was so unusual that it could not have failed to attract the attention of contemporaries. The absence of mention of a wife rather indicates the absence of marriage. What impact might the documents to be revealed in 2027 have on modern Christianity? This question concerns not only historians and theologians, but also millions of believers worldwide. We stand on the threshold of a potential re-evaluation of a 2,000-year tradition, a moment when ancient scrolls could alter our understanding of the figure at the heart of the world's largest religion. Modern Christianity is a complex mosaic of denominations and movements, each interpreting the person and teachings of Christ in its own way. Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants of various denominations all base their faith on canonical texts formed in the early centuries AD. But what will happen if documents from the Vatican archives offer an alternative view of the founder of Christianity? The readiness of the Church and believers for potential discoveries varies. Liberal theologians, especially in the Protestant tradition, already entertain the possibility of historical re-evaluations without threatening the essence of faith. For them, Jesus as a spiritual teacher and moral guide is more important than the historical details of his biography. Even if documents are found about his travels to India or marriage to Mary Magdalene, this will not undermine the foundations of their belief in Christ's saving mission. Conservative circles, on the other hand, are skeptical of any attempts to revise the traditional image of the Savior. For them, the historical reliability of the gospel narratives is inextricably linked to the dogmatic foundations of Christianity. Any deviation from the canonical image of a celibate Jesus, whose divinity was revealed from birth, is perceived as a threat to the entire edifice of faith. However, history shows the surprising ability of religious traditions to adapt to new knowledge. In the 16th century, the discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo seemed incompatible with the biblical worldview. But today, even the most conservative Christians accept the heliocentric model. In the 20th century, the theory of evolution caused sharp theological disputes, but many modern theologians have found ways to reconcile it with the idea of divine creation. The Vatican, aware of the potential impact of the archival documents, is preparing the ground for their reception. Catholic theologians are already developing hermeneutical approaches that allow new historical data to be integrated into the religious worldview without destroying its foundations. The key principle is the distinction between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith, between factual reporting and theological interpretation. Public perception of potential discoveries will be no less complex. In an era of information noise and polarization of opinions, any sensational findings will inevitably become subject to simplifications and manipulations. One can predict a surge of both militant atheism, using new data to discredit Christianity, and conspiracy theories about document forgery aimed at undermining faith. In these circumstances, the scientific community, historians, archaeologists, linguists, capable of providing a balanced assessment of new materials, acquires a special role. It is the quality of academic expertise that will determine whether the 2027 documents become the basis for deepening our understanding of early Christianity or a source of new divisions.